Well, the opening salvos have not been very promising, but you might well be right that this is part of a negotiation ritual. But I'm a little bit more worried because I think the UK side is really trying to play hardball. I think they're trying to shut the door on 31st of December. It seems to be sort of very high on the agenda. It's not that the Prime Minister hasn't walked back on previous deadlines, but this seems to be not cast in stone, but sort of wood carved at least, I would think. So this is a little bit harder to get away from. So if that is really sort of a binding date, I cannot really see how this will be all negotiated on all these levels, unless sort of it's like a string west type of agreement. Because you need to remember there's also sort of the summer break and there's Christmas, and then everything needs to be ratified in all the parliaments in Europe. I mean, this is going to take some time out. So the real net negotiation period is much less than the 10 months between now and the end of the year. So how to squeeze all that in with sort of a limited amount of goodwill to start off with seems to be very ambitious, to say the least. So I'm not holding my breath that we'll have a sort of full-fledged, all-encompassing deal by the end of the year.
There's not only the relationship between the UK and the EU at play here, but also among the 27 EU members. And throughout the first phase of negotiations, they exhibited a pretty remarkable amount of solidarity, not really deviating, certainly publicly, away from each other. Do you think now, I mean, you mentioned the different tensions between Germany and France on the international stage, for example. Do you think it's realistic to think that they can remain solid throughout this next phase of negotiations?
So I think, Julian, you're putting the finger on the right spot, exactly. In the first phase of negotiations, I think that London was surprised by how united Europe was. I think that's partly because they were misreading how Europe works. But now, it's really about the future, and there the interests will diverge, and I think the fault line, or one of the fault lines, will be along the Rhine River, as you say, between France and Germany, and France likely to play sort of a much more impatient hard line than Germany, which has much more to run on this trade relationship as well. So whether to hold up this very strong unity is quite questionable. Also interesting that Germany will have the EU presidency later in the year when it really comes to the wire. So they will have to play some leading role in that, and that is against their instinct of not trying to lead from the front on these matters and trying to work sort of more in the shadows to get to things done. So I can see sort of much more conflict between the European partners when it comes to the future trade relationship, when it comes to the competition, social, environmental standards, and all of that, than it was sort of on the Brexit itself. What are the conditions of exiting rather than what are the conditions of working together in the future? Will be very interesting to watch.
I mean, it's interesting that after this latest reshuffle, Boris Johnson now has effectively filled the top 4 positions in his cabinet with Brexiteers. So that's a shift in terms of the united front he now has in his own team in cabinet when it comes to negotiations. So one gets the sense that there is going to be a reluctance to back down here. What would be so wrong with the EU taking the Canada agreement, the CETA agreement, and then making it work for the UK? Because that seems to be where Boris Johnson is taking his negotiations. But at the moment, people like the French foreign minister don't seem willing to accept that as a template.
Yeah. Well, Canada is a small, faraway country for Europe, for starters, right? So the integration between Europe and Britain is sort of on a totally different level compared to Canada. But then also we must not forget sort of what both sides had already committed to, sort of in the withdrawal agreement, which is sort of, aspirational, going well beyond Canada. So walking this back is a little bit difficult now. And maybe there's just different interpretations of what's actually agreed. I mean, this is sometimes happens sort of with this diplomatic trying to square the circle. So everyone thinks they got what they want. But I actually don't think it's that ambiguous. So, it may come down to something like that. So the UK is, in what I can see, speculating that the EU will blink when sort of the deadline draws nearer. And the interpretation of London was that the EU blinked last time. I see it somewhat differently, actually. I thought the EU got what they wanted. And maybe they will blink. I mean, it depends on the relationship between the two main countries, like France and Germany, as we talked earlier with Juliana. But I think it's a very risky game. I would be much more comfortable if I could see that this deadline will be extended to a reasonable amount of time.
Is this going to be what determines the direction for sterling then over the rest of the year, do you think? I mean, we've seen the pound whipsawed by the ebbs and flows of negotiations previously around Brexit, I mean, over the last 3 years or so. Do we just get a perpetuation of that through the rest of this year, depending on how the talks are going? We'll either see sterling stronger or weaker.
Yeah, Jeff, I think that's exactly right. I think this will be the dominant factor. I mean, the political uncertainty has been removed. And as you say now, the cabinet is very aligned around the prime minister. There's a very dominant power. So the sterling will move sort of depending on whether a hard Brexit is likely or not. Because a hard Brexit, again, WTO rules is not attractive to the to the UK, I'm sorry. So the UK depends on trade much more on Europe than the other way around, just because Europe is so much bigger, despite the trade deficit and all of that. Yeah. So if you're running towards a hard Brexit scenario, which I'm not predicting today, it's very hard to see how this could be anything but bad for sterling.
Hi, I'm Joanna Bersecci and thank you for watching. You can check out more of our videos by clicking on the boxes on the screen. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more from CNBC International. Thank you for watching.